we're gonna turn to what, if any, documentations can cover hiring entities may request from employees with respect to the supplemental paid sick leave. And it's been kind of a common theme throughout the webinar that the executive order doesn't explicitly answer a lot of the questions that we may be addressing so far, and this is another one. Unfortunately, the executive order itself is silent on this issue. There is no clear-cut answer to this particular question either. The order simply does not specify whether workers must provide documentation to the higher entity either prior or after taking the supplemental paid sick leave. What the order merely provides is that supplemental paid sick leave must be made available to the food sector worker upon the oral or written request of the order to the higher entity. So if we interpret the order from a literal perspective, it would seem reasonable that at the very least, a hiring entity may require that the worker either verbally or orally provide the qualifying reason, which as my previous that can include a leave because the worker is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order, or because the worker is advised by the healthcare provider to self-quarantine or self-isolate, or because the worker is prohibited from working by the hiring entity for requesting the leave. If we can move to the next slide, Anthony. Now, even though there is no concrete answer to this question, I want to briefly note that this is the California State Supplemental Paid Sick Leave. As we mentioned throughout the webinar, employers must already comply with existing California paid sick leave as codified in Labor Code Section 246. What is unsurprising is that the language in the executive order for this supplemental paid sick leave actually parallels a lot of the California regular paid sick leave, with the exceptions that we discussed, such as the rate of pay. Both executive order and the California General Paid Sick Leave statute are both silent on this issue, though. Nevertheless, in approaching the documentation issue, it may be pertinent to analogize the regular California paid sick leave. Under California regular paid sick leave, an employer is expressly prohibited from denying an employee the right to use accrued sick days, and from discharging, threatening to discharge, demote, suspend, or in any matter discriminate against an employee, or for attempting to exercise their right to use accrued sick days. It should be noted that the Labor Commissioner's position is that if the employer requires supporting documentation from an employee, the employer may be liable for violating the statute. In our practice, we have generally recommended that for general paid sick leave, employers can still reserve their right to request supporting documentation from an employee for requesting paid sick leave. In other words, an employer may request documentation from an employee so long as it is not a precondition for providing or approving paid sick leave. Even if the employee ultimately does not submit any documentation, he or she is entitled to regular paid sick leave under California law. So the same argument could be applicable to this supplemental paid sick leave under the executive order. Now, another thing that I also want to mention is that for those entities operating in Los Angeles City, there is a definite answer as to whether they can request documentation. The LA City ordinance explicitly bars employers from requiring a doctor's note or other documentation for the use of city supplemental paid sick leave. So please keep that in mind. So what does this all mean? The bottom line is that as of the date of this webinar, there really is no straight answer as to whether hiring entities can request documentation from food workers. What we recommend is that hiring entities should approach this with caution and err on the side of providing workers with a supplemental paid sick leave, even if there's no supporting documentation submitted by the food worker.